My name is Gil Bindewald. Eric and I appreciate the opportunity to be here today and present, and I hope that the participants will enjoy today's glimpse into the subject of electricity. This presentation is divided into 4 sections. I'll be giving the first 2. They are a brief overview, discussion of system operations, and then Eric will be talking about system planning and finally identification of some additional resources that you can go to for more information. Electricity is a really broad and complex topic, and thus Eric and I have also tried to leave ample time for questions at the end. So please, if you'd like to, make sure to write in as was previously mentioned. Slide 2, please. The objective of the overview section is to provide some context on why electricity is important and the emerging challenges and trends. I will also provide some definitions of key components. Slide 3, please. Electricity is critical to the economy, the national security, and most other aspects of modern life. It powers our homes and businesses, and increasingly is fueling our cars. We're vividly reminded of the nation's dependence on electricity each time there's a catastrophic natural disaster and widespread interruptions of electrical power occur. The electric system's success is really when it remains invisible and that reliability is maintained. Electricity is a critical enabler to other industry sectors and infrastructure, including finance, communications, transportation, food and water supply, and even entertainment and leisure. Slide 4, please. Historically, electricity was viewed as a commodity, and the primary objective of the electricity system was to provide affordable and reliable power safely to consumers. Economies of scale led to a system comprised primarily of relatively large, dispatchable, centrally operated power plants. But now, emerging expectations are challenging that conventional system's evolution. Economics, such as changing fuel costs, have led to increased natural gas generation, along with more non-dispatchable and variable generation sources such as wind and solar. There's also more growth in generation at the distribution side. Expectations for growing engagement by consumers, along with their changing load characteristics and the potential for new technologies such as energy storage are appearing, as well as new sources of demand for electricity, such as electric vehicles, which could drive the need for more capacity down to the customer level. Environmental objectives are also prevalent, which are spread across a variety of temporal and spatial scales. Slide 5, please. The challenge ahead is complex. The system comprises over 3,000 utilities. Some of them are investor-owned utilities, others are electric cooperatives, and then there's public power and municipals. Over the past decade, electricity use has been increasing at a decreasing rate. In addition, there has been increased self-generation. You can see that in regions where there's been a growth in area things like photovoltaics. Homes and businesses are not only consumers, but now they're producers of electricity. Both of these factors impact the revenue, one that is traditionally emphasized on the sale of energy. The electricity system is not a homogeneous system. There's regional variance, grid technologies, generation types and fuels, consumer demand, markets, and even regulatory frameworks. Yet all of this diversity must work together to achieve reliability. The map on the right illustrates the jurisdictions of the individual reliability coordinators under the North American Electric Reliability Corporation. NERC, as it's sort of called, has been designated by the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission as the Electricity Reliability Organization under Energy Policy Act of 2005 to maintain reliability oversight. Finally, contributing to the challenge is the increased operational complexity. You see this again in the changing generation and load mix, cyber and physical security concerns, as well as emergence of various weather events. Slide 6, please. This slide attempts to show the extent of the electric industry. Includes a significant number of investor-owned utilities, 192. They account for a portion of the net generation, a significant portion of the transmission, and about half of the distribution that's out there. Publicly owned utilities and cooperatives account for approximately 15% of net generation, 12% of transmission, but the remaining 50% of the nation's electric distribution lines. That's represented by the graphic on the top right. Independent power producers have grown over the last several years, and the federal government even has 9 power agencies which are contributing 7% of the net generation. They're represented, 4 of them are represented in the diagram at the bottom. Slide 7, please. As shown on the diagrams of the left, much of the current electric grid was designed and built using technologies and organizational principles developed decades ago to serve large-scale generation sources remotely located from consumers, to accommodate one-way flow of power, and centralized control schemes with minimal feedback. There are 4 major components, and they're laid out on the right-hand side: load, generation, transmission, and substations, which help join the system together. The load is really the things that consume electric power. Generators, of course, produce electric power. And transmission and distribution are the connecting features or transmit electric power from generation to load. Transmission typically, as you see, as those towers, and distribution for many is the wooden poles outside their house or neighborhood. In the United States, electric infrastructure serves over 145 million customers, includes over 19,000 power plants, 55,000 substations, 476,000 miles of high voltage lines, and 6 million miles of distribution lines. What this means is that there's also a control center, or somebody acting like a coordinator to maintain these assets or to coordinate these assets for the purposes of economy and reliability. Slide 8, please. Load, from a utility perspective, typically begins at the meter. And the meter is a means of measuring the customer's energy use. There are 3 classes or sectors of load. Residential, which is approximately 38% of the retail sales of electricity measured in million kilowatt hours. Commercial, which is about 35%, and industrial, about 26%. There's also a small portion which is for transportation. There are 2 different types of loads, and those are both resistive loads and inductive loads. Resistive loads are typically things that are what had been the incandescent lighting, the heaters, like your oven or your toaster. And the inductive loads tend to be things that have motors, magnetic fields. Those are your compressors, your pumps, your fans, household appliances like washers, etc. And the grid has to be able to meet all those different load characteristics and do so in a reliable and affordable way. Slide 9, please. Energy is neither created or destroyed and is transformed from one form to another. Thus, electricity is, in a major sense, more of an energy delivery medium. And it's accomplished by transforming from a variety of other energy and resources. It can come from burning natural gas or pulverized coal, and then using that thermal energy to create steam, which spins a turbine connected to a generator. Within the generator, a changing magnetic field helps create a flow of electric charges within the wires, which is essentially electricity. And that should be a flashback to your old high school physics classes. Likewise, one can also harness the kinetic energy from wind or water, as shown in the top left, to spin a turbine and create electricity. Generators come in a variety of sizes, which are often identified in terms of watts, which is an indication of how much energy can produce in a period of time. Large coal plants or nuclear plants, for example, might be in the order of a gigawatt or 2, and natural gas plants or a wind farm may be on the order of a few hundred megawatts. Slide 10, please. Substations are the hub in the electricity system. They are the connecting point for what we've described as transmission, distribution, generation, and even load. The substation, its primary focus is to change voltage from one level to another. The top diagram shows the various voltage levels across the system, stepping up after the generator on the left, and then stepping down voltage at the distribution system as it approaches the customer on the right. The reason for this is to maximize efficiency. Losses are proportional to current, I squared R, and for level of power, voltage is inversely proportional to current. To keep low, current must be low, and thus electricity transmitted at high voltages. Substations are important for connecting generating plants, making interconnections between electricity systems, switching transmission and distribution circuits into and out of the grid, and regulating voltages across the system. Slide 11, please. As illustrated by the picture, an obvious difference between transmission and distribution lines is the size and scale. Transmission networks are constructed using multiple interconnected lines and paths, so the loss of a line or generator would not result in the loss of power to customers. This is something that's often referred to as an N-1 contingency criteria. Transmission networks are actively controlled, meaning that power may be routed in various directions. Distribution systems, as I referred to before, like the wooden poles that many people see or the undergrounded and within some subdivisions, are typically designed for power transport in only one direction, and that's towards the customer. Distribution systems tend to be radial, not networked. Think of it like spokes coming out of the center of a wheel, or in this case, the substation. And this is an example of a passively controlled system. The bottom of the slide on the left shows some of the voltage classes. And so you see transmissions, usually 69 kV and above. Distributions voltages are usually lower and into the houses in the neighborhoods. Slide 12, please. I'm now going to talk a little bit about how these pieces work together to reliably deliver electricity to the consumer. Slide 13, please. In this section, I'm going to try to illustrate how load and generation change over time, how to characterize who's involved in the operation of the electricity system, describe how the electric system is operated today and the complexity of the task, and identify some of the emerging operational challenges. Slide 14, please. Load is not constant. And if there's one element to remember, it's sort of this diagram. The diagram at the bottom, this is a hypothetical power usage for an American household, and they change dramatically. It's not one size fits all. But what's important to remember is that there's things called peak demand, which you see up at the top, and the average demand, which is sort of the average usage across the entire day. Now, your usage will fluctuate depending on if you're sleeping, if you're cooking dinner in the afternoon, if you're watching TV at night. But at the end of the day, what the utility or whoever's providing electricity needs to worry about is making sure that there's enough capacity in the system to meet your peak demand. And so as you look across other areas, for example, the office building, the hotel, and the theater on the top left, there are differences both in terms of the shape and magnitude depending upon what type of user you are. So for example, an office building will tend to grow or have a profile that's higher in the middle of the day and might drop off a little bit at lunchtime. A hotel might have higher usage as people are doing laundry at the early evening or the night, and so it might have a different characteristic. And then a theater, of course, with shows in the evenings typically, might have something that goes later into the night. The magnitude, as I mentioned, also changes. So a home might be in the order of 2 to 25 kilowatts, depending upon the size. Office building, maybe 4 times that, 100 kilowatts. Hospital, somewhere around 500 kilowatts to a gigawatt. But a large manufacturer or plastic plant could be tens of gigawatts. And the system has to be able to accommodate all of these. Slide 15, please. So all of these different types of load, they get aggregated into sort of what's called an aggregate load curve. And this is what the generators are sort of responding to. There are peaks, as you see here, in the winter and the summer. The peak on the winter side, let's say, and this is a hypothetical example, but somewhere around 37,000 megawatts. The valley, or the bottom of that curve, is somewhere around 26,000 megawatts. So it means over the course of that day, it's somewhat fluctuating over 11,000 megawatts, which means different generation needs to be able to be brought online to meet those demands over that course of the time to keep this in balance between the demand, the generation, and the load. Now that also fluctuates not only on a day-to-day basis, but it also fluctuates on a seasonal basis, which is what you see both in terms of the winter and the summer load curves. And it will change both the profile and likely the peak and the valleys associated with it. Another important characteristic that I just want to point out on this curve is on the left, you see there's 2 blue lines, so 31,450 and then down to 28,000. That's the point of maximum ramp rate. And so that difference is 3,450 megawatts. And that means that those generators need to be able to adapt or change 3,450 megawatts in that hour. So the generators are not just about energy, but how those generators can change their output quickly over time. And in a little bit, I'm going to talk about ancillary services, and ramping is one of those features that could be recognized in terms of the value. Slide 16, please. There are a variety of markets and regulatory structures across the U.S. From a market perspective, you have everything from structured, what I'll say pool-based markets for energy, to sort of traditionally vertically integrated regulated areas. State regulators are typically accountable for distribution and intra-state transmission rates. FERC, as the federal agency responsible for regulation, is responsible for interstate transmission. The diagram on the bottom there is the regional transmission organizations. They were entities established after a FERC Order 2000 in 1999 to basically control and operate the transmission grids free of any discriminatory practices. One of the other parts is that one of the roles that they often play is in running or monitoring the organized pool-based markets. So if you see those are also indications of where those markets currently exist. Slide 17, please. So I wanted to differentiate those pool-based organized markets from the bilateral ones. And the bilateral contracts are where a buyer and seller negotiates directly, and they sign sort of a two-party contract to trade their electrical power. Outside the RTOs, which are on the map in the previous slide, which are mainly in the southeast and the west, wholesale power trades occur through these bilateral contracts. And within the RTOs, they tend to use both the bilateral trading as well as organized markets that pool the sellers and the buyers. Slide 18, please. Economic dispatch is a means of determining which generating facilities are dispatched to produce electricity. The bottom of the curve on the right represents a variety of the generators that could be brought online, and there's certain generators and commitments which are critical to the reliable operation of the system. And then the diagram at the right, the left, illustrates sort of what's called the generation stack. And what that does is it sort of, based on bids or other factors, sort of ranks the different generations based on sort of the cost. The costs produced vary minute to minute, but the price is based on the marginal cost of that last unit needed to meet the demand that's faced. These costs include capital costs, such as plant investment, as well as variable costs and fuel. If you have higher capital costs, historically things like a nuclear plant, you tended to want to run them a lot, and so they factored in what was called base load generation, which is usually pretty flat. And then those that had increased variable costs but low capital costs, which was historically things like natural gas, they would often tend to be more for peaking purposes. But now with fuel cost changes and changing economics, natural gas is appearing in more of the base load and intermediate as well. Slide 19, please. So it's not just a matter of being able to understand the cheapest generation. You also have to look at the system limits, and that affects which generating plants are asked to produce electricity at a moment in time. Some of the factors that could help or affect these sort of grid constraints include generation, transmission, facility conditions, and their availability. So there might be transmission lines that are out for maintenance, or they have to reduce under, or have operate under sort of reduced limits, and that might affect the way that the generation is dispatched and affects the flows on the system. There's also different line capacities under different power flows and loadings, so you have to be mindful of things like the thermal limits. There's a point at which transmission distribution wires have a limited capacity, and that heat can cause damage and excess sag. So you need to be very careful about understanding what those physical limits of those wires are. But then there's also things like voltage stability, which is shown on the bottom, where that you need to also be very mindful of the reactive power that's coming onto the system and making sure that the overall system is stable and can be controlled. There's also the availability and capability of other grid facilities to manage the line loadings and voltages. So you're looking not only at the wires, but you have to look at things like circuit breakers and series and shunt reactive devices and transformers. And you have to understand what would happen, as I mentioned before, if there's a loss of those devices, and so that the system as a whole at the transmission level needs to be able to withstand potential conditions where something could happen. Slide 20, please. So summary of some of the system operations aspects. One, again, is to be able to assure system reliability per established standards, which in this case are identified at the transmission level by NERC, and at different system levels. So it's not only looking at a larger, what they call interconnection basis, which there's one in the east, west, Texas, but also at the balancing area and at the local area. There's also being able to, from a system operations, schedule, dispatch, and control the generation that's out there and the transmission assets. There's being able to understand congestion on the system and the flows and how that may impact the system characteristics and reliability. It does so by looking and monitoring various pieces of data and measurements on the system and doing things like state estimation, which is sort of a representative of what the state looks like now, as well as doing things like contingency analysis, which is basically a means of saying how, if I lose something, what is the impact upon the system? And is it positioned to be able to handle that and be robust to that situation? There's load and generation forecasting. But there's also some additional responsibilities that the system operators have, and they include things like ancillary services, which I'm going to cover in the next slide. Slide 21, please. So there's services that are provided that go beyond just the generation of energy, and they're needed to support power system reliability. Keeping the balance between generation and load within the limits that are defined is a challenge. Operators can schedule generation, but things happen. The loads change, equipment fails, and this is where there's a critical role for ancillary services. They help keep the system running. Operating reserve is the generating capacity available either immediately or within a short term in case that there's a disruption. Regulating reserve, which I highlight under the normal conditions, is an automatic reaction of the system to needed change in supply. The system senses through like a change in frequency that there's an imbalance between generation and load, and it allows a response. But there are other forms of ancillary services as shown here. One of them we talked about earlier on the aggregate load slide, which is ramping. But there's also services like voltage control to make sure, again, that the system is stable and maintains voltage stability. And there's something called black start. Some generators need electricity to be able to start up. So if you have an event and your system, for some reason, goes down and generators shut down, there are certain facilities that have the ability to start themselves without having external electricity to be able to start. And that's critically needed as you try to build up or rebuild your system after a storm or natural event, for example. Slide 22, please. So there's some broader operational challenges, and this is really emerging and creating a necessity for thinking about how the system will transform. The future generation resource mix is unknown. You have variability and uncertainty of generation sources like renewable energy, wind and solar, and they require new ways to operate the power system, including use of storage, natural gas, demand response. Load profiles are uncertain as on-site renewable energy sources, demand response technologies, electric vehicles are introduced to distribution systems. Evaluation of ancillary services, which I just covered in the previous slide, is continuing to evolve as new needs are discovered and identified. Boundary seams are critical. We talked about all the different market, regulatory, and technology aspects. Ensuring compatibility across these is absolutely critical to the overall reliability and resilience of the system. And then this continues to have to be able to adapt as new current concerns are continually emerging. Slide 23, please. I wanted to just include a slide to show some of the variability of the energy resources and some of the challenges that I mentioned before. Load and resource, the load, the demand, and the resource availability may not always be aligned. You see this on the graphic on the left with the wind and the demand. And also you see it on the right with solar. When the sun is shining, it works great. But if the operator needs to spread out any variability risk, they need to think about backup generation and reserves in case there's a problem. And what's happening increasingly is that improved forecasting techniques are being integrated into the operational tools, and there's a desire for ways to improve system flexibility, which includes things like storage and demand response. Next slide, please, Tor. So one of the ways that flexibility can be enhanced is through availability of data. And over the last 6 years or so, there's been significant investment through public-private partnerships in extending smart grid data sources, both at the distribution level through distribution automation and smart meter systems, as well as at the transmission system through time-synchronized phaser data to really be able to understand the dynamics that are happening in the system and some of the oscillatory behaviors that are out there. And that's really critical as we start moving forward and start thinking about new ways to operate and plan the emerging system. Slide 25. Energy storage is another means to sort of change the way we operate the electricity system. It provides energy when it's needed, just as transmission provides energy where it is needed. And some of the diagrams on the bottom right show the ability to use energy storage to be able to help spread some of the resource availability into sort of the valleys and be able to help reduce some of the so it's called peak shaving, but reduce some of the peak nature of the system and help make renewables more dispatchable. Slide 26, please. So I just wanted to recap some of the topics that we talked about. First, the operating characteristics of electricity. Demand varies considerably over the year, week, and day. Energy storage is limited. Electricity is produced the moment it is consumed. There's this balance between generation and load that occurs at a variety of scales. Utilities rely on reserve capacity for unexpected events and losses of supply. Utilities dispatch resources to follow demand based primarily on lowest cost to consumers while recognizing limits. Electricity market structures reflect regional diversity. There's also, as I tried to mention here, the difference between cost and price of electricity, and that cost to generate electricity tends to vary very much by minute to minute. Opportunities for innovation and transformation exist, like I mentioned, demand response and energy storage, to continue to address the emerging challenges. So slide 27. See if it goes to we lose the connection, okay. So the next section is on system planning. And for that, I would like now to introduce my colleague, Eric Rolson, who will discuss the system planning aspect.
So we're going to... Come on, Jackie.
Ladies and gentlemen, if you would like to ask a question at this time, simply press star, then the number 1. Again, if you would like to ask a question, please press star 1. And there are no audio questions at this time.
We have a question from Kevin Greenleaf. How much energy can you store in the western states to shave peak loads currently?
So was that question, how much energy storage is currently used?
Yeah, I think so.
And the DOE folks may want to jump in here. You know, there's a lot of talk about sort of new technologies for energy storage, things like battery storage and things like that. That is a growing area, but is very, very small. There are some conventional technologies that have been used, and that tends to be around hydro. So, you know, you've got a dam, and you can basically either hold the water back or you pump the water up. So you fill the reservoir, and that lets you then generate more power when you need it. So when there's not a lot of demand, you can generate, you can use other power and refill your reservoir. That's a more common, and it's been used longer. That's still not a big portion of it, but that's that is, you know, that's probably the biggest portion of it. And the DOE folks are probably much smarter about this than me.
So the Department of Energy has funded a number of research projects on energy storage as well, new battery storage as well as compressed air storage. So there are ways to provide additional resources. It's kind of a very system-specific question that we would probably need somebody from those specific areas to address, as like California ISO or WEC, the Western states, or
the Western Electricity Coordinating Council, which is the party responsible for reliability in the Western Interconnection.
Okay, just as a reminder, Kevin Culligan will answer questions regarding the Clean Power Plan, and Gil Vindewall will answer questions regarding the DOE presentation. So we have another question.
This question is from Jose Galvez Contreras. What are some alternatives to localize the national grid system? And this question would be, I believe, for DOE.
Can you repeat the question, please?
Sure. What are some alternatives to localize the national grid system?
I mean, there are, if I understand the question correctly, there's two different approaches. One is a system that's historically been there where there's look at the large flows of energy from sort of centrally dispatched generating plants to load. There's a considerable amount of work that's going on and research within the department to examine things like microgrids and better balancing generation and load locally. It's looking at distributed resources and demand response where the customers are more actively involved in participatory and understanding how they can be a part of the system instead of something that they're sort of away from. So there is significant effort that is underway to be able to extend it from just a transmission, centrally, again, large power plants to one in which that there are a variety of flexibility in terms of the options that might be available for planners or operators to choose from and to be able to take advantage, again, to maintain the reliability of the system.
And I would like to add that I would say a large portion of how the grid is controlled and operated right now is under state jurisdiction control. The federal aspects are very limited on electric transmission and generation aspects.
Okay, we have another question.
This question is from Dr. Jalon White Newsom. Can you please describe what was meant by discriminatory practices on slide 16? And this is for Eric from DOE.
Okay. And that was, so this is Gil.
Yeah.
That was language that basically the regional transmission operators are running competitive markets. And so in order to maintain the integrity of those markets and for both the participants and those that are using it, they just have to be, the information has to be transparent and fair across all of those that are choosing to participate.
So this refers back to the OAT, the Open Access Transmission Tariff as well, which is a FERC-run process.
So we have another question from the Adobe Connect participants.
Okay, this question is from Jose Galvez Contreras. Again, are there discussions of development of storage plants to capture renewable energy resources not in use? And I think this might be potentially for Kevin Culligan or for DOE, and maybe it could be a take team one.
DOE would probably do a better job than me,
Okay.
I'm guessing.
So there are examples of, as was mentioned by Kevin earlier, there's a variety of technologies, and what I'll say is power and energy attributes of energy storage. So how much energy they can hold and how quickly they can basically provide that energy to the system. And there have been a variety of technologies that have been integrated for different purposes across the system, including renewables integration. And one of the places I know in the last few years there's been significant demo projects in coordination with the states in places like New York and California to be able to understand the value and how these can contribute to the system. And there's more information. DOE has, for the energy storage questions, DOE has an energy storage site which talks about some of the projects, and under the Recovery Act, there was a smart grid demonstration program, had some energy storage demonstrations, whose report is also on a website called smartgrid.gov.
Okay, we're going to take 2 more questions from the Adobe Connect participants. And I believe both of these questions are for you, Gil.
Okay. The first question is, how does hydro storage impact electricity storage? How does it work as storage? And this is from Ellen.
So like pumped hydro storage, what you're doing is it's really a temporal change to the system. So as I was mentioning before, you're basically trying to balance your generation and load in real time. And so what you do is you're able to basically pump the water up when electricity is available and cheaper, and then it comes down when you need it and you're under limited availability or from other places. And
right. The typical aspect is you want to most often you pump the storage in the middle of the night when electricity is cheap and run it during the middle of the day when electricity demand is much higher.
So what it does is it allows you to sort of change where you saw that demand curve that I presented, it allows you to start smoothing out the peaks and the valleys a little bit with the generation to be able to meet those needs.
Okay, we're going to take one last question before we resume our webinar. Do you want to go ahead and do it?
Okay. Sure. This question is from Jennifer Crossling. How does one control an average of power coming into a structure? And this is for DOE.
So you don't, it's a great question. It's a great question. You don't actually control the flows into any particular entity. What you're doing is you're really looking as a system and saying, is everything in balance? So is there enough real power? Is everything out there? And you do that by looking at frequency. And as I sort of alluded to, is if you have less generation than the load is demanding, your frequency drops, and so you bring more generation on to be able to meet those needs. And if for some reason your load is greater than what you have in terms of generation, your frequency would increase, so it's a signal if you're monitoring it to be able to reduce the amount of generation that's currently producing. And so what you're looking at is the overall system and monitoring then saying, are there constraints within the system? So across specific transmission lines or or generators, et cetera, that could be overloaded. And so you're looking at the overall system and saying, hey, is there enough energy in the system to be able to get to where I need it? And if so, based on these flows, am I overloading any particular element? And if so, then you need to rethink on how it's dispatched.
And the only thing I would add is that there is a lot of research work performed on I wouldn't say power flow control, but work on understanding how buildings and structures receive power through the Office of Energy Efficiency and Renewable Energy at the Department of Energy, the buildings program within.
Yeah, and there's a lot of work as well on the distribution side with things like smart meters and sensing on the distribution side over the last few years, where there's more visibility than there had been historically. Typically, on the distribution side, there wasn't a tremendous amount, as much visibility as there was on the transmission side, but that's changing with the deployment of more sensors as well as tools and technologies to be able to understand what's happening there. But it's a great question.
And another way to look at this, and this is Kevin Culligan, is sort of all of the technical issues related to transmission aside, when a individual or a company or a municipality is purchasing green power, renewables, wind or solar, you know, generally what you know is on the grid and over a larger area, there's more renewables and more of that green power than there would have been otherwise. So you're seeing a real reduction in fossil use and CO2. What you don't know is at the house that purchased it, the company that purchased it, the town that purchased it, whatever, what exactly their mix is. But you know somewhere there is more renewables being used because of those arrangements.
Okay. Thank you, Kevin and Gil. Now we're going to resume the webinar. Operator, please mute the lines. Eric?
Yes. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Eric Rollison. I, along with Gil Bindewald and Caitlin Callahan, which is who else you may have heard here, work in the Office of Electricity Delivery and Energy Reliability. I'll be walking you through the final two sections of the presentation today. Section 3 is going to focus on system planning, and Section 4 is going to provide a short overview of additional resources available for more information. Next slide, please. There are 5 specific objectives for the system planning section. I'd like to cover who develops system plans, what's included in these system plans, when these plans are developed, how the plans are developed, and what are some of these typical system planning practices. So let's begin and have some fun. Next slide. Within the bulk power system, which is typically the portion of the electricity system operated at 100 kV or 100,000 volts and above, there's a functional entity which we refer to as a planning authority, which integrates and coordinates plans within its boundaries. Planning authorities are supposed to have the knowledge of current and future system plans regarding transmission facilities, such as when a facility is expected to be in or out of service for maintenance, when new resources are scheduled to come online or be retired, and what are the set points for arming and the activation of protection system elements within the system. Planning authorities are a North American Electric Reliability Corporation, I say that 5 times fast, functional entity, and follow reliability standards to guide their practices to ensure consistency of outcomes. Entities, i.e. utilities, register to perform these functions, as compliance with reliability standards is mandatory since the passage of the Energy Policy Act of 2005. More information on the reliability functional model, which planning authorities are a part of, and the entities registered to perform these functions can be found on NERC's website. Next slide. This slide reinforces the 3 main activities of the electric power system planning: oversight of transmission facilities and service plans, resource plans, and protection system plans. A planning authority can be thought of as an information clearinghouse. To accurately plan for the future with the least amount of uncertainty possible, these entities require the highest fidelity data and information possible regarding the current and future system design, as well as the schedule of generation and transmission outages. Examples of planning authority areas within the United States would be companies such as PJM Interconnection, which operates in the Mid-Atlantic United States, and the Bonneville Power Administration in the Western United States. Next slide, please. So far, I've talked at a high level of who is producing these system plans, and at a 50,000-foot level, what is included in the system plans. But now let's dive a bit deeper to get additional fidelity of what's included. Electric system plans include the schedule of when new generation resources are expected to come online, usually by the month and year, when new transmission infrastructure is expected to come online by month and year, what future enhancements are going to be made to existing generation capacity, such as generation upgrades at a nuclear facility, upgrades to transmission infrastructure, such as upgrading a 230 kV circuit to a 500 kV, or adding an additional circuit to an existing transmission line, when generation resources are scheduled to retire, and the required technical attributes of the system to maintain system stability, such as the thermal operating parameters of transmission lines for both the normal and emergency operations, as well as frequency and voltage parameters necessary to maintain system operations. System planners take all of these inputs into account when they're generating future system plans, with these plans most often being filed for comment and approval at both the federal and state level. Next slide. Next slide.
Slide 32.
Yes, slide 32.
Sorry.
Long-term system plans for the bulk electricity system facilities are developed on a defined schedule, which typically occurs on an annual basis. The timing and development of these plans are contingent on a number of external factors and regional needs. To best understand your regional system planning cycle, I would suggest reaching out to your local planning authority for more information on how to engage in these processes. It should be noted that planning processes are typically open to stakeholders and the public. Next slide. Hold on. Slide 33. Go back one. Please go back to slide 33. Thank you. The planning cycle, once started, is continuous and builds upon the results of previous studies and analysis, which could indicate system issues which require mitigation or future system needs to maintain reliability. Starting at the top and moving clockwise through the graphic, the cycle begins with the planning authority identifying the current and necessary future system attributes, i.e. facilities expected to be in service, and the scenarios to studies. These scenarios typically range from the normal and extreme future demand scenarios to the unplanned loss of critical facilities on the system during extreme peak demand. The progression of the system planning process noted here is typical and may not include all the features of your local planning processes. One of the attributes that I would like you to take away from this slide is there are typically a number of points for stakeholders to engage with the planning process. The cycle, as noted before, is dependent on a number of external factors and can last from multiple months to years in duration. Next slide, slide 34. The final topic I would like to cover in this section is the typical technical attributes of how system plans are developed. I would like to note that this list is in not any way comprehensive and is meant to provide a broad overview of some of the technical attributes of system planning. From the start, it should be noted that all generation resources are not treated the same during the planning process, as their performance profiles are different and need to be accommodating when developing future system plans. For example, traditional baseload resources, such as nuclear or combined cycle units, are planned at a level expecting their rated output, which may be somewhat below their nameplate capacity in future system plans. This is different from variable generation resources, such as renewables, whose generation capacity may vary over the period of day due to the prevailing weather conditions. For future system plans, variable generation resources are typically derated from their full capacity output to accommodate the variability of their output. For example, if you have a 100 megawatt wind facility in a future system plan, it may only be planning for 13 megawatts of that output. However, that does not mean that that entire 100 megawatts of capacity will not be taken if available by the system operator. The percentage of the capacity D-rate is left to the discretion of the local planning authority, and this capacity D-rate is most often determined probabilistically using past system performance attributes. System planners also need to accommodate how system demand or load will grow or decline in the future based on a number of econometric attributes. The planner will take into account how policy mandates require the system designed and or operated. This can include focuses on system performance, i.e. setting performance for loss of load expectation calculations, which are typically 1 day of load loss over a 10-year period, to how the system is designed and operating, including a focus on installed and planning reserve margins and the percentage of renewable generation sources on the grid. Next slide. Sweet, we're already there. Wrapping up, slide 35, please. Wrapping up this section, we went through a number of different aspects of system planning in a very short period of time. As you probably understand, each of these sections could be expanded into a longer course. This presentation was focused on providing a top-level overview of system planning. I summarized the major themes of the section on the slide. The one aspect I want you to take away is there are multiple points to engage in the system planning process as it is a public process. And move forward to slide 36. We'll finish with a quick overview of resources available for more information. Next, slide 37. In the limited time left, I want to highlight a few aspects. One is there are a number of different federal agencies involved in electricity system analysis. The best reference I can provide in this topic area to provide more sufficiency of what goes on in the electricity system is the Federal Power Act section of the U.S. Code. It outlines the roles and responsibilities of different federal entities engaged in the planning of the operation system. A great place to start with this is, and within the federal code, is 16 U.S.C. 824, which is Title 16, Conservation, Chapter 12, Federal Regulation and Development of Power, Subchapter 2, Regulation of Electric Utilities, Companies Engaged in Interstate Commerce. A specific reference if you're looking for aspects which goes into very discrete detail. Next slide, slide 38. I also wanted to highlight there are a number of high-quality data sources available to understand and characterize our current electric system. The two repositories that I want to highlight for this audience would be the EIA 411, Coordinated Bulk Power Supply and Demand Report Survey, which identifies trends in future system generation as well as future system demands, and the EIA 860 Annual Generator Survey, which characterizes our current generation fleet in the United States. Next slide. Lastly, there are a number of additional federal resources available which can provide additional depth and context in the status of our current electric system. The reference I would like to draw attention to on the slide is the recent release of the Quadrennial Energy Review by the Department of Energy. This document provides a contextual overview of the status of our current energy system while providing a number of different policy recommendations for the future. Next slide. I want to thank my co-presenter, Gil Bendewald, as well as Caitlin Callahan for setting up this information. Our contact information is provided as additional questions.
If you would like to ask a question at this time, simply press star, then the number 1.
So thank you, Eric. Yeah, that was Eric. Sorry. Thank you, Eric. That was great. Gil, Caitlin, thank you so much for coming over from DOE to give this presentation. It was very informative. And as you could tell by the first half, there were a lot of questions. So I'm sure we're going to have a lot of questions for the second half. Again, there are 2 ways to ask your question. The first one, you can type it in to Adobe Connect, and we will pull from there. If you would like to speak your question, you can use your phone, and we'll take turns going back and forth to the questions. Again, Kevin Culligan from EPA will answer questions regarding the Clean Power Plan, and Eric and Gil and Caitlin from DOE will answer questions regarding today's presentation.
This one on the bottom.
So the first question from Adobe Connect.
The first question comes from Rhonda Anderson. Does America share any grid space with Canada?
Yes, I only covered the U.S. attributes, but system planning within the Northeast, Midwest, and the West encompasses planned transfers from in and out of Canada. And Caitlin, I don't know if you want to expand on this any.
Oh, go ahead.
I was going to say, if you look on slide 5, where I highlight, this is Gil, where I highlighted the North American Electricity Reliability Coordinators, the reliability coordinators, it shows the North American aspect and the role that Canada has in coordination to maintain that reliability.
And how this works in daily basis is there's planned transfers of electricity. The electricity imports and exports are scheduled usually on an intra-hour basis.
Okay. We have another question from Adobe Connect.
Yeah, can you please repeat the 16 USC 824 code reference?
Sure. It's 16 USC 824, and that if you search for that in Google, you will actually, or whichever your favorite search engine is, that will bring up the code related to electric reliability, but I can repeat the entire aspect of it. It's Title 16, Conservation, Chapter 12, Federal Regulation and Development of Power, Subchapter 2, Subchapter II, if you really get technical, Regulation of Electric Utility Companies Engaged in Interstate Commerce.
We're going to take another question from Adobe Connect.
This question comes from Dr. Jolene White Newsom. She appreciates the highlighting the point of engagement, but for knowledge, is there an electricity ombudsman that can help communities walk through or highlight significant places where they can interject in this process?
We lost you about halfway through that question. It sounded like someone was shuffling some papers. Can you please repeat that?
Sure. The question is there an electricity ombudsman that can help communities walk through or highlight significant places where they can interject in this process?
I would suggest reaching out to the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, as they are an oversight mechanism, and they'd be able to best place you where to inject in these processes, because most of the aspects when plans are filed with FERC are open to public comment.
And the same state. They're at the state level.
Yeah, at the
there
state,
are
yeah.
processes through either the PUC, Public Utility Commission, or PSC, Public Service Commission, that would be available for you to tell schedules and processes that were underway.
And depending on where the generation or other asset that you're looking at is located, some information is also provided by the regional organizations on their respective websites.
So we are going to take another question from the Adobe Connect.
This question is, what effect would a major storm have on regulating the system?
So I'm assuming from a regulation standpoint, it's the operational side of the regulation. And there's been an extensive amount of work that's been going on, again, within DOE and elsewhere, to be able to help balance that generation load, looking at things like islanding as well as backup generation, and being able to understand ways to make the system more resilient as well as recover faster. One of the ways that this is happening, and there's actually, again, a report on smartgrid.gov site, is looking at things like the deployment of sensors across the distribution network. By having those, instead of waiting for somebody to call in and say, hey, my power is out, now utilities can get a real-time snapshot of the system state and where there might be problems or issues, and be able to focus their attention on resolving those. And so it really helps more effectively allocate the resources they have and the personnel to restoring the system. The reality is the storms will always be there, and so the other challenge has been being able to say, how do we reduce some of the challenges or traditional vulnerabilities that may come from the storms? And again, that's where there's an extensive amount of work right now within the DOE looking at some of those research-based challenges.
And I would say also we've advanced significantly since the 2003 blackout and took a lot of the recommendations to heart, and you see those in the energy policy, the changes that the Energy Policy Act of 2005 made to the structure of the electricity system, and it's a subject of ongoing work and research and development at the department to understand and characterize how storms can impact the grid and what their potential impacts are. And I would say not only 2003 was a large driver, but Hurricane Sandy in 2012 was also a large driver of fundamental change.
Okay. Thank you for that. I let you know that Kevin Culligan has left to go to another meeting, so we won't be able to take any more questions regarding the Clean Power Plan, but feel free to ask questions regarding the presentation. So we have another question?
Sure. The next question is, Japan has deployed a tremendous amount of solar after suspending its nuclear fleet after Fukushima. They have had some challenges managing fluctuating production. Sorry, just a second. Managing fluctuating production. Would the U.S. grid have the same challenges, and what could we do now to accommodate large-scale renewable additions?
So the way I would, so this is Gil, to accommodate the large scale, so let's back it up. I don't have enough visibility or understanding of what's happening in Japan to make a comparison there. But what I can say is happening in the U.S. is really twofold. One is to make sure that there's a necessary and prudent investment in the capacity that's out there to accommodate and access the variety of renewable resources and generation, associated generation that's resulting from that. And the second is really to be able to develop and understand new operational techniques and tools that are able to see the system with that higher level of dynamics and deal or handle with some of the uncertainty that may emerge from them. And some of that's included, as I alluded to, putting forecasting into the operational tools, better forecasting itself to understand the variability, being able to create the flexibility through demand response, energy storage, or transmission topology control, really to give operators the levers that they need to be able to maintain the reliability of that system.
And I would also, too, that a lot of these aspects where you see growth in renewables that you would say, this goes back to a question we had earlier, that access is non-discriminatory to transmission, has encouraged the development of a lot of renewable resources throughout the country, both in the Midwest, Southwest, Southeast, and the Northeast as well.
Okay, thank you. I'll remind the participants there are two ways to ask a question. The first one is to type it in to Adobe Connect, which you seem to be doing really well. And the second way is to ask through your phone lines. So we'll take another question from Adobe Connect.
Okay, the next question is in regards to blackouts. What happened during the big blackout in 2005 and 2004, 2005?
Okay. So the major blackout that I think you're referring to, August 2003 in the Northeast, really highlighted the need for improved visibility into the overall transmission system. Since the 2003 blackout, and I mentioned this in passing, but there's been an extensive amount of work with public-private partnerships in deploying what's called synchrophaser technologies. And what these are high-fidelity sensors that are able to not only see what's happening in the system, but they're synchronized, so you're able to relate or understand what's happening in one part geographically versus another part of the system, and you're able to compare those. And it's really important in terms of understanding some of the changing behavior and oscillations, et cetera, that may be happening. And I think what's also been developing is new tools and applications through the Transmission Reliability Program and through work such as something called NASPE, which is the North American Synchrophaser Initiative, to be able to help the industry understand how this data can be turned into actionable information at both the operational and planning scale, to really try to, and I think what's highlighted here is really try to understand and get that wide area of visibility and situational awareness to help maintain and preserve the reliability of the system.
And Gil, I would add on, and this is Eric, is also that there's been, I would say, a strong enforcement of vegetation management practices for the bulk system, whereas I wouldn't say there were issues prior to that, but I would say there's very strong compliance to vegetation management practices, which leads to better understandings of what Gil was talking about in some of his slides and some of mine, where the thermal parameters of how transmission lines actually react during high temperatures. We're in Washington, D.C. here, and it's a very warm day. Just characterizing this, it's a warm day. There's going to be a lot of power flowing through the electricity lines. The lines are going to sag further or droop, if you would say, further than they normally would into the clearance zone. So it's important to have those maintained, or you could have a tree contact and a fault on the system.
So, and this is Gil, just add one. So for those of you who are not familiar with the August 2003 event, DOE and FERC did produce a report that looked at the causes and recommendations, and that is publicly available both at DOE's and FERC's website if you did a search for that 2003 Northeast blackout event. And it goes through and explains what happened and the nature of it. And as Eric referred to it, it's everything from better understanding and gaining visibility on the system and tools and training, as well as understanding things like voltage and even just the reliability in general, the NERC role with ERO. Mm-hmm. So again, there's a report that's out. It's dated somewhere around 2006, I think. But it really goes into detail about what the causes and recommendations of that event would be. And the department as a whole, again, working with industry, states, and other decision makers, really has gone a long way, in my opinion, in trying to put in place technologies and solutions that would help mitigate situations such as that.
Great. Our next question comes from Marianne Hatch.
Can you please discuss the current cost barriers to storage as well as the economies of scale that utility scale generation exhibit?
Repeat. Would you like the question repeated?
Yeah, can you repeat it one more time?
Yes. Can you please discuss the current cost barriers to storage as well as the economies of scale that utility scale generation exhibits?
So this is Gil. It's a complicated answer because storage can take on multiple roles in the system, and we talked a little bit about peak shaving, but there's and that's sort of like an energy balancing change. But there's also things like providing instantaneous support, so like regulation support, et cetera, and that impacts the technology, and that impacts the nature of what the cost of that technology would be. So there's a variety of scales. What I would point to is there was a report that was done by DOE probably about 2 years ago, which is an energy storage program plan or a multi-year plan that cuts across the department. What it's been working on is DOE as a whole through work with RPE and Office of Science and EERE and the Office of Electricity is really not only being able to understand the integration costs, so being able to connect a device in the system and the costs associated with it, but it's going right back into the device level chemistries, for example, and how that might be able to expand both the capabilities and the cost aspects of the technology. And that includes, again, in other materials associated with the device. There's work that's been going on in power electronics, and in some cases that's 50% of the cost of some of these devices, depending if it's energy or power applications. So it just depends on how the energy storage device is being used, and then again, what then the technical hurdles are to be able to, that need to be addressed. But the program plan does try to lay those out over a variety of technologies, and that again is publicly available.
And as Gil has mentioned earlier, there are, I believe, energy storage demonstration projects both in New York State and California that are online, activated within the grid, where they're probably learning, I won't speak to specifics because this isn't my area of expertise, there's probably more information regarding those projects out on both DOE's and CalISO and New York ISO's website.
And this is Caitlin. I think the only other thing I would add to that, at least in terms of how storage may play in sort of the market side of things, you may want to look at FERC's Order 755 and 784, which are recent as in the last couple of years, and there's a lot of sort of buzz around what the implications of those two orders might mean for how storage is sort of valued and can sort of contribute to the marketplace.
Okay, thank you. So Caitlin, Eric, and Gil, you guys have been real troopers. We have 2 more questions. So the next question.
Okay, this is, what happens when there is an overload of power?
So this is Gil. So in theory, I mean, this is the way the system is designed, is that there's protection that goes in place to prevent that overload from damaging any equipment. So the goal is basically to say, you know what, there might be conditions that you have problems that you don't see. If it gets overloaded like a transmission line, what I want to do is have breakers or something else open up the lines, just like you would a circuit breaker in your house, fuse in the old days, to prevent it from causing damage. And then the reason for that is if it gets damaged, it's going to take you longer to restore. So the idea would be is if I basically interrupt it, take whatever that overload condition is out, and then be able to address the situation so it's not overloaded, then my system can be brought up back to a normal state very quickly. The worst case would be is if an overload condition actually caused equipment damage. But again, the planners and operators really put a lot of thought and analysis into making sure that that system is as robust and to protect both the safety of the people, consumers, and personnel that would be interfacing with it, as well as the equipment itself.
And to add on to Gil's point, there are contingency studies, I would say, run to understand the characteristics down to a very discrete level, and I'm talking actually down to even the actual type of steel used on an electric transmission line to understand how much that element can be overloaded to, with it still maintaining safe operating margins for the entire system. If it exceeds those actual aspects for an overload, the system, as Gil went, the protection system would activate ARM. And we're talking, when we're talking here about protection systems taking action, We're talking in
Milliseconds.
a very, very short time frame. We refer to it in the electricity industry as a certain amount of cycles, but it's a very instantaneous action that most often you don't even notice or see on the power system when you see your lights on.
Okay. We have one last question.
Okay, this question is, if you could include what local communities can do to help fill gaps in planning and implementation of new generation to replace outdated or soon-to-be outdated facilities. For example, Indian Point in Buchanan, New York. I'll read that again because it was kind of a long question. If you could include what local communities can do to help fill gaps in planning and implementation of new generation to replace outdated or soon-to-be outdated facilities. The example provided was Indian Point in Buchanan, New York.
Did you get that?
Do you want to start?
So this is Caitlin. I just want to say, we can't comment on specifics with regard to any single generation, but I will say that the siting process for any kind of resource is also generally not a federal process, as Eric was saying. I mean, there are a few examples in terms of FERC's authority, but when it comes to siting generation of basically non-hydro projects, it's generally done at the state and regional level. So I would suggest for any level of engagement that you'd reach out to those authorities and find out what their individual processes are within your kind of footprint.
Yeah, and I was just going to go back to the states with the PUCs and PSCs. Normally when all these facilities at a state level or federal level are being considered, any plans, they're openly discussed. And so I think it's to the extent that people are interested, it's a good way to understand where the challenges are. The one thing I'll come back to, and I tried to highlight in my briefing, is that all of these different pieces of the system have different contributions. It's not just about energy, but they have different roles in making sure that the lights stay on. And so I think one of the things to be aware of is that is understanding all the ways that the local community and the facilities are in the local community are contributing to that system, and how those what the importance is. But I think just as Caitlin was saying, I think more and more that balance between generation and load, the end use side, that's the load side, the community side, is becoming a critical element in this decision process.
And I think just talking in more generic terms is understanding while you see, we won't speak to specifics, that when you may see a generation facility at a specific location, it may not be contributing to that local area's demand, but it may be, it's connected to the larger system and may be helping support other areas' aspects. Most large regional markets, as Gil was talking, RTOs are subdivided. We talk in generics that we talked about, New York ISO or PJM interconnection. They're subdivided into specific load zones, and those specific load zones have specific characteristics which they have of both generation and demand over periods of time, as well as different points in the year. So there's a whole realm of a layer deeper where you get into really specific system characteristics and how things that may appear on the surface not to be needed are necessarily needed on a very finite level. A perfect example is just generically songs in Southern California and the aspects that needed to be taken for reliability when that unit was shut down.
And I think really the message to take home from all of this is electrons don't really respect jurisdictional boundaries. They're all connected together through the pieces of the system that Eric and Gil have described for you, but it's pretty much a free-flowing network at that point from the electrons' perspective. So it is very hard to pinpoint, one generation source to one particular customer.